Yeah, I'm willing if you're speaking.
Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome back again to another session on the series The Injil, that is the Gospel. We've looked at about two. We started this series three weeks ago. Yeah, and then we've looked at two subjects on the Injil, and today we'll be looking at um, the historical evidence for the Injil, that is for the Gospel. Now, if you've been following us all through from the first session on the Injil, just let me make a recap. We did what was the Injil. That is what the Injil is. So in the in that we speak about the different gospel. That is, the Injil for Christianity is different from the Injil for Islam. So they are not the same Injil. What the Injil that Islam is talking about or is referring to in its Quran is not what we Christian believe in. And actually, when you then look at what the Injil is in Islam, then it becomes problematic because Islamic Injil does not really give you what the Injil really is, because the Injil is the Injil, and there's nothing unique about the Injil in the Islamic perspective, in the sense that when they tell you what was the revelation that was given to Jesus, they will tell you to preach the oneness of Christ, to live a righteous life, and thereabouts. That is what is talked about in Injil. And the question is that what was the revelation that was given to uh, uh, all the previous prophets? It is the same revelation. What was the same revelation that was given to the same revelation that was given to Jesus Christ? So it means that there is nothing unique. So why should you give it a different name? Why not just give it one name in essence and say because it is the same revelation, then it should be the same uh, name. So it really does not even give you what the meaning of the Injil, that is the good news. What makes the oneness of God, Tawhid, or whatever thing that they claim that the Injil is to Jesus Christ, what makes it unique? It's because this is the same message that had been preached by the previous prophets, according to Islam. So therefore, we move to the reliability of the gospel. Why is the gospel reliable? Then we look at um, the the writings of the gospel, those that did the writing, because in Islamic perspective, they believe that the writers of the gospels are not actually the writers of the gospel. They believe that it was somebody else that wrote the gospel. But then in last week we looked at the writers of the gospel, those who wrote the gospel. We look at the sayings of the church fathers um, on who wrote the gospel, and the sayings of these church fathers actually what made the sayings of this church father unique is that all these church fathers are from different nationalities and different continents. But guess what? They were all both saying the same thing about the writers of the gospel. John wrote John, Matthew wrote Matthew, Luke wrote Luke, Mark wrote Mark. And as a matter of fact, one of the things we also look at is the fact that if Mark and Luke were not the writers of the gospel of Mark and Luke, why then should the early Christian attribute it to them, knowing fully well that Mark and Luke does not actually hold a prominent position in the church? Why can't they just ascribe it to Paul the Apostle, who is a very, very prominent and very, very strong, influential part of the church? Why couldn't they just ascribe it to James, who is a pastor of the church? Do you understand? So this kind of a thing would even give it more credibility. But because they were not the one that write it, because Mark and Luke were the one that wrote that same gospels. We looked at that also. We look at the datings of the gospel. Muslim will tell you because John gospel was written 90 AD, and why we agree to that these are just the German scholars' opinion or German scholars dating. But then when we look at the internal evidence, we could come to the conclusion that the gospel were written way more later than that. But nevertheless, even if you go with the German dating of the gospel, it really does not actually change anything. Because when I mean anything, it does not really diminish the credibility and the reliability of the gospel. It still beats every ancient work in antiquity, even if you should date it later than the internal evidence dating. Okay, so for today we'll be looking at the historical evidence for the gospel. Now, what make these subjects unique or different from the last week on we did was that last week on we actually narrowed down on Christians church fathers who are Christians, and we made use of the Bible to know what the gospel, the reliability of the gospel, and why we should trust it. And that alone, it satisfies. If you're a Christian, it satisfies you. Okay, probably if you are somebody that is so logical to a large extent, you would accept what was spoken of last week on the reliability of the gospel. But today, we want to take it a step further in the sense that for the critics, when I mean critics, for Muslims, atheists, agnostics, and whatever group you belong to, that do not believe that, they will often come up with the excuse that, look, these people, they are Christians, so you cannot expect them to say or to tell you something that will be different from what is going to make Christianity better, like Church for the Papias, Irenaeus, Tertullianus, and those people that we quoted last week. They are all Christians and they are all apologists also, but they would often defend the Christian faith. So we don't have any reason to trust them. That is, this is the same thing that the critics are going to say. You can just go to the next slide, ETM, because I'm already doing the introduction. So this is what the critics are going to talk about, that the church fathers are. But now, what they are going to, no, just the introduction. So what they are going to now speak about is just that, okay, an evidence outside of the Christian faith that actually confirms the reliability of the gospel. So what we'll be doing today, that's what we'll be doing. That is, every of the historical evidences that we'll be bringing out will not be from the scriptures, that is, will not be from the Bible, and neither will it be from any Christian scholar from the ancient past or any Christian historian from the ancient past. You understand? But will be from outside sources that are not Christians, those that are not even Christians at all. So that they have nothing to do with Christianity. Even some of them are even hostile to Christianity. They don't like Christianity, they don't like Jesus Christ. But they are the ones that will be quoting now. Let us look at what they have to say. And mind you, one of the criteria is this: number one, they have to speak about Jesus Christ, not even and Christianity at large. That's number one. Number two, and these sources, that is, these historians, they must be from either the 1st century or the 2nd century, nothing later than the 2nd century. So meaning that we will not be quoting any historian that is later, that is from the 3rd century, just 1st and 3rd century. Isn't that amazing? So next slide, please. So therefore, the first historian that will be quoting is Phlegon. So Phlegon, writing from around AD 140. So I would want you can just read the whole, after the session, the slide will be made available for you to go through. But just for now, I will just be reading the quotations of these historians, what they have to say about the gospel. So what does Phlegon have to say? Please, can you make it a little bit bold, ECM?
Bigger or
Bigger.
Okay.
Okay.
Church
Now, okay. That is what it said. Now, Phlegon, in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his chronicle, not only ascribes to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the results corresponded to his prediction. Now, that is, Phlegon is saying that Jesus Christ actually predicted future events. This is Phlegon now, who is not a Christian, who does not have any benefit to quote Jesus Christ and to confirm that Jesus Christ is actually, he said that Jesus Christ predicted the future. and the prediction of Jesus Christ was actually accurate. He says also that, and with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appeared to have been crucified, and a great earthquake which then took place. Phlegon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his chronicles. Now, Phlegon now is talking about the during the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He is confirming what the Bible says about the fact that there was an earthquake when Jesus Christ was crucified, and also that there was darkness all over the place when Jesus Christ was crucified. This corresponds with the writings of the gospel. Okay. Now it talks about Jesus Christ predicting future events. This and that his prediction actually came true. This also corresponded with the gospel. Now let us continue. It says, we have in the preceding pages make our defense according to our ability, addressing the testimony of Phlegon, who relates that this event took place at the time when our Savior suffered. And he goes on to say that Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the mark of his punishment and showed how his hand had been pierced by nails. It was as if Phlegon was quoting what actually happened word for word in the Bible after Jesus Christ arose. If you could remember, when the disciples saw Jesus Christ, and then they saw him, and then they greeted him, and after that, he disappeared. They went to Thomas and told Thomas, who is also called Didymus. They told him, look, we saw Christ. And they said, no. Thomas was doubting. He said, no, I won't believe you until I see him. And I'm able to touch the piercing of the nails in his hand. This is exactly the same thing that Phlegon was saying. This confirms the gospel. And also, Phlegon also talks about that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ resurrected. After he resurrected, he appeared to disciples, then showed them the footprints of the nails. This is a man writing from the mid-second century and confirming what was written in the gospel. And this man is no way a Christian. He did not believe in Jesus Christ, neither is he a Christian, neither does he intend to become a Christian while writing this in his this historical record. But he was writing an historical fact.
You're muted if you're speaking.
Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, we now have Julius Africanus. Now, listen. Julius Africanus was not actually the one quoting here. Julius Africanus was just quoting Talos. And let me make this point clear. Like I spoken of in the previous slide. You see, when it comes to historical record, most historical records are preserved by quoting from previous historians. So historians does not have a problem with this. So the fact that Africanus is quoting Talos does not diminish the fact that what Julius Africanus is actually quoting is wrong. This does not in any way undermine the historicity or the reliability of this historical record, as historians accept and believe that this is one of the ways that antiquity records are being kept, by the quotations of other historians. Do you understand? So, of course, in those days there was no internet, there was no web to preserve all this. So one of the ways that they could preserve it is by quotation. So when the quotation is being made by other historians, and then that quotation outlived the initial historian who actually made that quotation. So it still means that that is actually still valuable and still accurate. Now, this is Julius Africanus quoting Thallus. What did he have to say? He said, on the whole world, there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls as appears to me without reason an eclipse of the sun. Now, Thallus is also saying the same thing that Phlegon wrote back then, saying that, look, Jesus Christ was crucified and there was darkness. And after there was darkness in the whole of Judea, not just Judea, but in all of his districts also, then there was an earthquake. And Thallus is saying that this earthquake, these things there was no reason for it to happen. Why? Because this darkness did not happen when there should be an eclipse of the sun, but it just happened all of a sudden. So there was no reason why this eclipse of the sun should have happened. Then Julius Africanus was actually quoting what Thallus was saying. And guess what? One of the things that actually make this very, very interesting is the fact that some of the places and locations that were mentioned in the Bible were also actually being mentioned by these historians, meaning that the location where how this took place were also reliable too. You know, it's a different ball game whereby when you are saying that something happened, but you got the location wrong. But for the fact that the location were also right, take for instance in Phlegon wrote that during the reign of Tiberius Caesar was when Jesus Christ was crucified, meaning that it was an historical fact that Jesus Christ came when Tiberius Caesar was in power. So the same thing here also. Thallus also was talking about an earthquake and a darkness, an eclipse of the sun that happened in the whole of Judea and in its districts. Now, this actually aligned with the same location where it was said that Jesus Christ was crucified. So can you see the collaboration? And this was written by a non-Christian historian, and guess the year, 55 AD, in the 1st century. And actually some people, now if you are to go with the German dating, we're going to say that this actually happened, or this quotation was actually made by Thallus from eyewitness. That is, he knew some eyewitness to this event. Not just that. Number two is that this saying was popular within Judea and within its environs. Not just that, it was also popular all over the world. Why? Because Jesus Christ was a huge historical figure, not just an ordinary historical figure. He was a man that was known all over the Roman Empire because of his credible deeds and work. Of course, when a man raised the dead, somebody that raised a dead man that had been dead for 4 days, of course, people is going to know him all over the Roman Empire at that time. So Thallus himself was not just quoting from his head, but he knew eyewitness that actually knew these sayings, because in AD 55, this was when the book of Corinthians was written. This was around the same time when the book of Corinthians was written. So definitely, when Paul was talking about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, saying that Jesus has appeared to him lastly, and then that he appears to about 500, of whom most of them were still alive till date. So meaning that as at that time, those that witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ were still alive. And this was at the same time when Thallus was quoting this, meaning that Thallus knew the eyewitness to these things and he met them. And so he was quoting a very, very reliable thing. And guess what? This man had nothing to gain from it because he wasn't a Christian. He doesn't love the Christian. He has nothing to do with Christianity. But as an historian, he just had to write what was the fact. His duty he has taken the oath to be an historian. So therefore, he must write the accurate fact, even if he does not like the fact. Next slide, please. So we have Celsus. Celsus is writing from AD 175. And this is what Celsus wrote. He said, in imitation of a root. Please, can you read for me, Ibuji? I'm showing my eyes.
Yes, of course. It says an imitation of a rhetorician training a pupil. He, Celsus, introduces a Jew who enters into a personal discussion with Jesus and speaks in a very childish manner, altogether unworthy of the gray hairs of a philosopher. Let me endeavor, to the best of my ability, to examine his statements and show that he does not maintain throughout the discussion the consistency due to the character of a Jew. For he represents him disputing with Jesus and confuting him as he thinks on many points. In the first place, he accuses him of having invented his birth from a virgin, and upbraids him with being born in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country, who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery, that after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself to God.
Thank you. So now, this is what Celsus is actually quoting in general. Now, this was Origin quoting Celsus, that is, it was responding to Celsus, to what is claiming about Jesus Christ. Okay. So what Origin was doing was that he actually quoted the sayings of Celsus, and he was actually responding to what it is. Now, from the sayings of Celsus, what did Celsus say? Number one, that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin. Number two, that Jesus Christ claimed divinity. And number three, that when Jesus Christ's mother conceived him, that his father Joseph thought that his wife to be had committed adultery, then he had to send her away. So which actually conveyed the initial thoughts of Joseph when he learned that Mary was with a child, had already conceived. So he wanted to send her packing, not until when the angel, all this I'm quoting now, it actually corresponds with the gospel, with what was written in the four gospels. It was the same thing that was written in the four gospels that Jesus was actually seeing. And this was written in the late second century. And he was actually quoting this then. Origin was actually correcting some of Jesus' misunderstanding about what was going on. But one thing that you can take from it is that number one, Celsus was telling that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, which was according to the gospel. It's according to the gospel. Number two, Celsus quoted that Jesus Christ claimed divinity, which is according to the gospel. Number three, Celsus quoted that Jesus Christ performed the miracle, which is also according to the gospel. And number four, Celsus quoted that Jesus Christ's father wanted to um, separate with Mary because she had conceived a child out of wedlock, supposing she had committed adultery, which actually is what the gospel actually says. And this is a man who is also not a Christian and has no gain in it whatsoever. But they were actually quoting the right thing at the right time and saying what is actually correct. The next slide, please. Now, this is Lucian of Samosata, quoting from AD 166. So, what does Lucian have to say? He says, the Christians, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced, can you quote for me, please, Buji?
Yes, definitely. It says the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel right and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers. From the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his law.
Thank you. Now, this Lucian was not a Christian, was a Greek. And as a Greek, as a Grecian, he's going to be serving the Greek gods. Okay. And you will see that in his statement, it's actually referred to Jesus Christ. And it's mentioned three things about Jesus Christ. Number one, he said that Jesus Christ was a founder of a religion who was who was crucified. That is a religion that was assisted with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Number two, he said his followers were converted and considered themselves spiritual brothers and sisters. And number three, he says that Jesus Christ followers worship him as God. Please, Jesus Christ followers worship him as God. It's it baffles me when you hear Muslims says that that the disciples of Jesus Christ did not believe that Jesus Christ is God. What have you? And yet, if you say okay, let us take away the Bible. Now let us look at what historians have to say concerning this. This was Lucian saying that Jesus Christ actually was worshipped as a god by his followers, by his disciples. That is, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, definitely you must worship him as God, as deity. If he was not God, why would the early apostles or early disciples, why would they worship him as God? Okay, so you could see this attestation from the church fathers, I mean from the historians, and how this attestation actually correspond and correlate with what the gospel had said. Wow. All this correspond with all what the gospel writers had written. And these people were not this like Lucian now. Lucian was not a Christian. He was a Greek, but confirming the same thing that the gospel wrote. Next slide, please. It's here. Now, this is Maraba Serapion, writing from the 1st century. Can you please give me the quotation, Buji?
Yes. What else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by truant? Their wisdom is captured by insult, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because their country was completely covered in sand in just 1 hour? Or the Jews by killing their wise king, because their kingdom was taken away at that very time. God justly repaid the wisdom of these three men. The Athenians died of famine, the Samaritans were completely overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every nation. Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new laws he laid down.
Now, what Mara Bar Serapion was saying is, though the name of Jesus was not quoted directly, but it is not far-fetched. When you read it, you could easily, if you are familiar with the Gospels, you can easily know that what the man that was called the wise king and the king of the Jews definitely had to be Jesus Christ. No mistaking about that. So he was just talking about the fact that he was ascertaining the fact that the Jews crucified Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ was crucified. That is, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was an historical fact. And this was a quotation from the first century, and this is AD 73. Now let us go by the German dating. Even this quotation is actually earlier than the Gospel of Luke, rather. It's actually par to par, almost par to par with the Gospel of Mark. If going by German dating, at least the Gospel of Mark is said to be written at around 70 AD. So this man and was quoting around 73 AD. So this is actually par to par with the Gospel of Mark. And then he was quoting the same thing. And this man was not even a Christian. So he was actually attesting the fact that to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ actually resurrected. This is very, very enlightening. So when you see Muslims now saying that we did not crucify him, but it was made to appear so. Now, somebody like this man who lived in the first century, now coming back to tell you that, look, I lived here in the first century, though I wasn't an eyewitness to these things, but from the record of eyewitnesses, and this eyewitness, there was no way they could lie, because it was something that was so common at that time. Even your Mark was writing at 70 AD. I came 3 years later to witness to this thing, that what Mark wrote is actually true. Even after me, Luke came. Even after me, Matthew came. Even after me, John came. So, and they both write the same that I'm telling you. And I'm not a Christian. And look at me, I'm telling you the fact that Jesus Christ that they are preaching now was crucified. And I am not a Christian. Would you not go with the fact that what was written and documented in the gospel was actually the fact, and what was written in the Quran is the false? When you have such an external witness to this fact. The next slide, please.
Pliny the Young.
So we have Pliny the Younger. Would you please, can you quote for me?
Yes. In Book 10, Letters 96, it says, others whose names were given me by an informer first said that they were Christians and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worship your image and the statues of the deities, and curse the name of Christ. But they declare that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, Their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver.
Now, going by what Plain the Younger said, number one, he says that Christ claimed divinity. That's number one. Number two, that Christ's followers worship him as God. Number three, that Christ's followers meet weekly, because this was a letter by Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was the governor, so he was writing to Trojan to know how to deal with the Christians. Okay, so then what Trojan then replied to him was that the Christians, that anyone among them who is a Christian should be punished and should be killed. That anyone who recants then should be pardoned. But what we note here is the fact that number one, that anyone the that Jesus Christ was worshipped as divinity by his followers. That is a fact. And number two, that they set some weekdays aside to worship him. If you can remember in the book of Acts of the Apostles, they said, and the apostle moved from house to house, and they continue in breaking of bread and in prayer and in fasting. So, and in the apostle doctrine. So, meaning that they had a day in which they chose to worship Jesus Christ. And especially the fact that he was worshipped as God and he claimed divinity and that he was crucified, which actually corresponded with the narration in the four gospel. And this was actually coming from somebody who is not a Christian, not just a Christian, but this was coming from somebody who is against Christianity, that they were killing Christians, but they actually ascertained the fact that this was an historical fact. And this man was writing from the early second century, that's around 112 AD. That was when they are writing, this governor was writing from. And still attest to the fact that Jesus Christ was God. His followers believed that it was divine and that it was worshipped. Can you request for any more evidence than this? Next slide, please, Uji. So this is Sothenius. Sothenius is a very, very historical figure. Everybody knows him. Can you please quote for me?
Yes. Suetonius, he said this: since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of the Charistus Christ, he expelled them from Rome.
So what Suetonius actually confirmed was the fact that, number one, that Jesus Christ was actually an historical figure and that it caused a lot of disturbances during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Don't forget, one of the things that I told you about is the fact that that these historians, they did not just confirm the existence of Jesus Christ, neither did they confirm the gospel alone, but they actually confirmed that the cities that were written within the gospel were actually accurate, were actually true. Because, and the people, the figures, these historical figures were people that actually lived during this time. And Suetonius was writing in the early second century, AD 120, quoting the fact that there was Jesus Christ that actually existed and caused disturbances within Judea and during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Next slide, please. Everybody know this man, Josephus, one of the foremost recognized Jewish historian. What does Josephus have to say?
Yes, Josephus. I know that is the Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote this. And at this time there was a certain Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of incredible deeds, a teacher of men who received truisms with pleasure. And he brought over many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was thought to be Christ. When Pilate had condemned him to a cross of the accusation of the first man among us, those who at first were devoted to him did not cease to be so. For the third day it seemed to them that he was alive again, given that the divine prophet had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up till now, the tribe of Christians who were named from him has not disappeared. This is from Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3.
And one of the remarkable facts that Josephus mentioned, number one, is the fact that he said the birth of Jesus Christ was actually believed to have been predicted by prophets of old. Okay. And Josephus is one of those historians that actually made us to know that to know the about James, the brother of our Lord Jesus Christ. He spoke about the family lineage of Jesus Christ, his mother, his brothers, the death of James, and and some of the and some of the apostles. So, and this man is actually writing from late first century, confirming the same thing that the Bible had already said. And guess what? Josephus was even he was the one that documented um, the the siege on Jerusalem during AD 70. He was the one that he was the one that actually documented it, and it's so baffling that a Jewish, and if you know a Jew, you know how hostile Jewish are to Christianity, and even you should know how Jewish are, how hostile they are to even Jesus Christ himself while he was alive, because he claimed divinity, and they really believe that he's actually divine. And they really believe that it's actually divine. And you know what they did to him. And guess what? This is also a Jew. He did not even convert to be Josephus converted to be to the side of the Greeks. So he was not even a Christian at that, and neither does it of the Christians. He was only recording the fact of what actually happened, and everything he spoke, everything he wrote rather, were in line with what the four Gospels writer said. Next, please. Tacitus. Quote for me, please, Buji.
Yes, of course. Tacitus, he wrote this. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on the class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstitious, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So that's from Tacitus, Roman scholar from Annals, book 15, chapter 44.
Now, let me make this say this. You would go through the slide, but one of the most profound sayings about Jesus Christ was actually from this man, Tacitus. Why? Because Tacitus' writing was not something that was passed down orally, like that of Phlegon, like that of Thales. But this was an independent writer. His writings were preserved, number one. Number two is that he actually made some remarkable statement about Jesus Christ that it is when you read this statement, it is undeniable that this was referring to Jesus Christ. Number one, he said that Jesus Christ was killed under Pontius Pilate. Wow. Pontius Pilate. Isn't that the same Pontius Pilate the Bible mentioned about that Jesus Christ was killed under him? That he had to release a Barabbas instead of Jesus Christ for the Jews? Pontius Pilate. This was coming from not a Christian, not somebody who is a follower of Jesus Christ, but a Roman, for that matter. And so it was coming from, he said Pontius Pilate was that Jesus Christ was killed under Pontius Pilate. Number two, it talks about the death of Jesus Christ under Pontius Pilate. It also talks about
Are you there, brother? Bishop Project Network. Maybe the connection. Technical difficulties. I know that he will come back. The connection. Uh, yeah, just to finish off, we'll just read what says. Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. So we see even in Tacitus, who's a Roman historian. So this passage is of, and I'll quote what he says. This passage is of great importance to biblical scholars for several reasons. So first, there is no question as to its authenticity. The writings of Tacitus, one of the greatest historians that was there. And secondly, we see Tacitus is seen as an independent source. So there does not seem to be any literary or oral dependence between his description and the gospel accounts. Okay. Uh, so even when we see here that uh, when it comes to his writings of the historicity of the Gospels, we can see the honesty going here even in Tacitus' writings, even when it comes to the crucifixion. As Christian Paul Jez was pointing out, that when it comes to the Pontius Pilate, how can they be wrong here? Even in the Gospel, we see that when they wanted to uh, give whether we should crucify Jesus or Barabbas, right? So that is very, very significant of his writings. And we see thirdly, it affirms numerous details about Jesus called Christus, including his historicity, his death under Pontius Pilate, and the persecution of his disciples. Furthermore, by describing the mischievous superstitions. Tacitus may be referring to the belief of the early disciple that Jesus had risen from the dead. So a lot of Muslims would love to bring this objection. Well, Tacitus is ambiguous. We can't know for certain who actually was he referring to. Was he referring to Jesus? Because he just said that there was a man in Christ. Well, he didn't just say that there was a man in Christ. He said there was a man who was called Christ, Christus, who died under Pontius Pilate, who was crucified. So I would challenge, show me anyone in the first century, anyone by name who claimed to be the Christ and was crucified, suffered under Pontius Pilate. Just give me one. I know a lot of them will try to make things up, but just give me one, okay? Because if you will say it's ambiguous, obviously we should know. We know who the historians were talking about. Obviously, we know that they were talking about the first century Christ. Even though the medieval Rashi want to say that it's King Agrippa, but we couldn't find any indication with King Agrippa claiming to be the Messiah and who was crucified. So, I know Christian Project is not here, so I'll just finish off him. So, in conclusion, we'll conclude with this. Each of these sources Christian Project brought up, the historians in the first, second century, on their own provides limited information regarding the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. Taken together, though they provide a remarkably detailed summary of Jesus' life, certainly they attest to the fact that Jesus of Nazareth existed. So, furthermore, even if we did not have the New Testament books and simply relied on non biblical sources, we would know the following about Jesus. So, these are the following he point out. The following are this: he was reported to have been born of a poor virgin, and that his family was a carpenter. I think we will find this in uh, we find this in Tellus or Celsius. Celsius. Yeah, see Celsius. It says this. Uh, she did disgracefully give birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty. So one Celsius is one of them who affirm that he was born of a virgin in a poor family, and his father was a carpenter. And another reason is he was a teacher, and his disciples passed on his teaching to others. Another one, he prophesied, performed miracles. Another one, he was known for his wisdom and his virtuous life. Another one, he claimed to be God. That's something that contradicts with Islam, contradicts with Muhammad in the Quran. And another one, he was crucified by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar in Judea. Another one, that an earthquake and darkness accompanied his death. Another one is his followers reported that he had risen from the dead, appeared to them, and showed them the wounds in his hands. Another one, his followers worship him as God. So this is a key significance. We see that the followers, the historians, agree, and even though they may not agree with this, but they are honest with history. They say that the followers of Jesus, worship Jesus as God, as divine. Another one is belief in Jesus caused disturbances with the Jews, which lead to Claudius' decree for the Jews to leave Rome. So, in fact, Jesus was so well within a century that word of him likely reached no less than 7 Roman empires. So, Claudius, who evicted Christians from Rome, Nero, who persecuted Christians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, under whose patronage Josephus wrote, and Trajan, who relied to Pliny. So, we're gonna give a banger as well. We will give a banger. Watch this. One of the historians Muslims love to quote is this. I will This is from Bart Ehrman. Let's see if they agree with this. Let's see if they agree with this. From Bart Ehrman. Okay. Okay, good. Hope that this screen is good enough and large enough. Okay. Uh, I'll just share this bigger. Okay, so this is the radical implication of the resurrection. He wrote this April 21st, 2019. Who is this for? Butterman. So, over the years on the blog, I have reflected a number of times on the significance of the earliest Christian beliefs in the resurrection. On this Easter morning, I thought it would be appropriate to return to one of those reflections. The most important result of the disciples believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead, was that it radically changed their understanding of what it meant to say that Jesus was the Messiah. Good. So the first point is that But Ehrman confirmed and agrees that the disciples was convinced and believed that Jesus raised from the dead, and that changed their perspective on Jesus. He says, as we continue, as I have explained before, that in my view, Jesus did believe he was the Messiah in a certain sense, and his followers believed it. Given everything we know about Jewish beliefs at the time, that almost certainly mean that they thought that he was or would become the king of the Jewish people. That's certainly how the Roman governor Pontius Pilate took it. So it was because Jesus made such a claim that Pilate ordered him crucified. The crucifixion, so he agreed, because of those claims Jesus made, the Pontius Pilate wanted to crucify him. The crucifixion would have proved beyond any doubt to anyone paying attention that Jesus was not the Messiah after all. Rather than overcoming the enemy to establish a new kingdom, he was quashed by the enemy, publicly humiliated, and tortured to death. That was the opposite of what would happen with the Messiah. Okay, but then something equally dramatic happened. The disciples came to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. This is Bart Ehrman, by the way. They started working out the implications of the belief of that belief for understanding Jesus, and it led over a long series of reflections among a number of Jesus' growing band of followers to rather amazing conclusion. And it in fact is the beginning of the idea of a Trinity. This is Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, are you saying that the disciples, because of the resurrection and was fully convinced, they started to come up with the idea of the Trinity? Wait, but didn't they get the memo that the Trinity started at the Council of Nicaea? Even Bart Ehrman recognizes that the disciples believed in the Trinity. So the point being laid was this, is that so the point laid is that according to the Islamic text, the disciples are the most victorious until the day of resurrection. So the disciples, if they are victorious, then we should know what did they taught in the first century. What was their belief in the first, second century? If they believe that Jesus was crucified, Islam would be false. Because according to the Muslims, he was not crucified. So this is another dilemma the Muslims have. So I know that Brother Christian Apologetics not there because he had a Wi-Fi issue. So that was another extensive presentation from his part on the gospel and the historical evidence by pointing to non-historian, well, historian who are not Christians, to point to the evidence of the existence of Jesus and their crucifixion, their miracles. He was born of a virgin, and that does not correlate with Islam. So thank you all for that. And I will say this, that Jesus Christ is Lord, the only hope of salvation. As the Apostle Paul tells us, Romans 10, verse 9, he says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. The only way to be saved today is by believing in Jesus Christ as your only Lord, your Lord, your Master, your Savior, and your God. Without that, you have no salvation. So what do you want to do? And that's what I would rest our case. And I would say from myself, ETM Apologetics, Christian Apologetics Network, Ready to Reason, General Apologetics, and we'll come back with still another series. And next week, Gospel, we're going to get into Jesus in the Bible and the Quran. Okay, so stay tuned for that, and God bless.